Colombia's government reported 3 different depths for the same earthquake before anyone agreed on what actually broke underground. A magnitude 7.4 quake tore through the country's west, felt by 10.5 million people, and a city 200 kilometers from the epicenter recorded shaking stronger than towns standing right on top of it. Officials called it routine aftershock activity. It isn't. This earthquake did not happen on the fault responsible for Colombia's last major disaster. It happened somewhere else, deep inside the moving plate itself, and the aftershock data now arriving from Chaco is still actively being decoded. Monday morning, 7:34 local time. San Jose del Palmar, a small town of a few thousand people in Colombia's Chaco department, sits almost directly above the rupture. Within seconds, the shaking reaches Bogotá, Cali, Pereira, Manizales, and crosses into Ecuador, Panama, even Venezuela. The United States Geological Survey logs it at magnitude 7.4. Colombia's own geological service, the SGC, confirms the number within the hour. According to the USGS shaking map, roughly 10.5 million people experience strong to very strong ground motion, more people than live in the entire country of Portugal. In Manizales, one of the twin bell towers on the city's neo-Gothic cathedral snaps and collapses into the nave. In Bogotá, more than 200 kilometers away, residents describe emergency sirens ringing through the dark before sunrise even arrives, dogs barking, glass rattling in windows nobody thought could shake that hard. By every early measurement available, this becomes the strongest earthquake to strike Colombia in a century. The immediate damage spreads unevenly, and that unevenness matters later. Risaralda, where Pereira sits, reports the highest early death toll. Valle del Cauca, home to Cali, follows close behind, including 3 children among the dead. More than 10 airports suspend operations, some from direct structural damage, others simply to inspect runways before allowing another aircraft to land. Chaco itself, ground zero for the rupture, is one of Colombia's poorest and most remote departments. Dense rainforest, reachable in many places only by boat or small aircraft, which slows rescue teams trying to reach outlying communities near the epicenter before anyone even finishes counting the dead in the cities. The obvious explanation writes itself, and for good reason. Colombia sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the Nazca Plate grinds steadily beneath the South American plate, generating roughly 2,500 earthquakes a month, most too small for anyone to notice. A large one was, statistically, always coming. That part of the story checks out completely, but almost immediately the official numbers stop agreeing with each other. Colombia's Geological Service first places the rupture at 82 kilometers underground. Within hours, that figure is revised upward, past 96 kilometers, edging toward the USGS estimate of roughly 110. A quake this size doesn't usually have its depth rewritten 3 separate times in a single day. And depth, it turns out, is not some minor technical footnote scientists argue about for fun. It is the single detail separating 2 completely different categories of disaster. Shallow earthquakes, the kind that made this coastline famous for the worst reasons, happen where 2 plates grind directly against one another close to the surface, and they are the ones capable of shoving enormous volumes of ocean water upward into a tsunami. This one did not happen there. USGS analysis places the actual rupture roughly 100 kilometers down, inside the Nazca Plate itself, well past the boundary where it meets South America. Geologists call this an intraslab earthquake, energy released from stress, bending and twisting inside a plate that is already sinking into the mantle, and it behaves nothing like a shallow interface rupture. Think of the difference between 2 plates jamming against each other at a joint and a single bone cracking somewhere along its own length under the strain of being bent. Both hurt. Only one of them can push an ocean. Even the agencies that finally agree on the depth cannot agree on the fault. USGS lists 2 competing solutions for what actually slipped, one suggesting an oblique reverse left lateral break, the other a moderately dipping right lateral strike-slip fault running in nearly the opposite direction, the kind of split verdict that would normally get resolved within a day or 2, except this time it hasn't. Independent seismologists reviewing the data openly admit the precise fracture inside the slab still hasn't been pinned down. Colombia had just absorbed its strongest earthquake in 100 years, and 3 days later scientists were still debating, in real time, exactly what had broken beneath their feet. The first comparison anyone reaches for is 1979. On December 12th of that year, a magnitude 8.1 earthquake ruptured just offshore from Tumaco, on Colombia's southern Pacific coast. It struck barely 23 kilometers down, shallow enough to violently displace the seafloor, and it triggered a tsunami nearly 6 meters high that killed somewhere between 300 and 600 people, with waves eventually recorded as far away as Panama, Costa Rica, and Hawaii. Colombia's Geological Service itself describes this month's earthquake as the country's largest since Tumaco. Said that way, the comparison sounds like a warning. For a moment, it should. But the resemblance stops almost exactly at the size of the number. Tumaco ruptured along the shallow interface where two plates physically meet. This new earthquake ruptured inside one of those plates, buried far too deep to meaningfully displace the ocean floor above it. No tsunami warning was ever issued this week, and none was actually needed. Same coastline, same colliding plates, a fundamentally different kind of break with a fundamentally different kind of danger attached to it. So if this isn't a repeat of 1979, what actually happened underground, and why can't anyone name the fault? That question is where the investigation runs into its next wall. The Nazca Plate, as it dives eastward beneath Colombia, does not slide smoothly. It bends, flexes, and twists under enormous internal stress as it sinks, and somewhere inside that twisting motion, something finally gave way. USGS models produce two almost equally plausible rupture geometries oriented in nearly opposite directions relative to each other. This isn't a case of missing data, it's a case of a plate complicated enough at this exact depth and location to genuinely support more than one honest answer. That uncertainty is not just academic. The geometry of the break helps forecast how aftershocks will spread and where the next one is more likely to strike. And 3 days in, no agency is willing to say with full confidence which of the two fault geometries is the real one. Here is the detail that should not add up on its own. Deeper earthquakes are usually gentler by the time their energy reaches the surface, losing strength as it travels upward through more rock. Yet in Jamundí, roughly 200 kilometers south of the epicenter, ground motion sensors recorded stronger shaking than several towns sitting almost directly above the rupture, registering a peak acceleration well above what nearby Manizales recorded despite being much farther from the source. That is the anomaly buried inside the opening numbers, and here is what explains it. Jamundí and a number of the hardest-hit neighborhoods sit on soft river valley sediment, the kind of loose ground that doesn't simply transmit seismic waves. It amplifies them, trapping energy the way a shallow bowl keeps a marble rattling long after it should have settled, instead of letting it roll off and disperse the way firmer bedrock would. Northwestern University seismologist Susan van der Lee points to exactly this combination, a large intraslab rupture meeting soft alluvial soil, as a likely explanation for why the destruction reached so much farther than depth alone would predict. In Cali, that combination meant the pediatric and neonatal wing of a hospital came down. It meant an apartment building collapsed with an infant still inside, later pulled from the rubble alive on camera. Depth did not decide who got hurt. The ground underneath their homes did. And the ground has not stopped moving. Within hours of the main shock, Colombia's Geological Service logs 21 aftershocks. By that evening, the count reaches 47. The strongest of them, magnitude 5, strikes just 44 minutes after the original rupture, close enough behind it to be genuinely alarming to anyone still standing in a damaged building, dust still hanging in the air from the first collapse when the second jolt arrives. By the following day, the tally passes 70. By Wednesday, more than 100 aftershocks have been recorded across the region. This is the part of the story that lives inside the data rather than the headlines. Intraslab aftershock sequences do not behave like the shallow kind. They can cluster tightly, go quiet for hours, then reignite as stress redistributes through the bent, brittle rock of a subducting plate that is still settling into a new shape. A seismologist at the University of the Andes puts the honest version bluntly. The real question was never whether Colombia's fault network could produce another jolt, because it always could. The actual question is whether this specific sequence is winding down the way most aftershock sequences do, or migrating toward a segment of the plate that hasn't released its accumulated stress yet. Nobody credible is forecasting a second major quake. Everybody credible is asking for more data before ruling one out. Most aftershock sequences follow a predictable curve, a steep drop-off in frequency and strength over the first days and weeks, the geological equivalent of a struck bell going quiet. Intraslab sequences don't always follow that curve as cleanly, because the stress isn't relaxing along one clean surface, it's redistributing through a three-dimensional tangle of bent rock. That's precisely why Colombia's aftershock count, sitting past 100 and still climbing 3 days later, is being logged and rechecked hour by hour instead of simply written off as background noise. The same day the ground shook, so did a volcano. Purase, a peak roughly 200 kilometers away in the department of Cauca, sent up a fresh column of ash that afternoon, dusting rural communities nearby and closing the airport in Popayan to commercial traffic entirely. And within hours, social media had already fused the two events into one story, insisting the earthquake had woken a sleeping volcano back to life. It's a satisfying explanation. It is also wrong. Colombia's Geological Service checked the record and found that Purase had been escalating since the 1st of August, more than a week before the earthquake, with its own seismicity, gas output, and ash emissions climbing on a completely separate timeline. The agency found no measurable change in the volcano's behavior that could be attributed to the earthquake at all. Two real, verified, simultaneous crises unfolding in the same country on the same week, and no shared mechanism connecting them whatsoever. A nearly identical correction had to be issued about an even larger rumor. Weeks earlier, in June, Venezuela had been struck by its own pair of major earthquakes, magnitude 7.2 and 7.4, together killing thousands of people. Colombian seismologists were asked directly whether the two countries' earthquakes were somehow linked. They are not. Venezuela's ruptures came from lateral, sideways movement between the Caribbean and South American plates. Colombia's came from the Nazca Plate sliding underneath South America entirely. Different boundary, different mechanism, different fault system altogether. What looked for a few anxious days online like a widening regional pattern was, once the data was checked, simple coincidence in timing and nothing more. Which brings the story back to the one comparison that is actually earned rather than assumed. Tumaco, 1979, 2 in the morning local time. A magnitude 8.1 megathrust rupture tore open the shallow interface off Colombia's southern coast. Survivors described the ground rolling for what felt like minutes before the sea pulled back unnaturally far, then returned as a wall of water nearly 6 meters high, erasing coastal settlements between Guapi and Tumaco before dawn. Somewhere between 300 and 600 people died, most of them from the wave itself rather than the shaking that preceded it. It remains to this day the deadliest earthquake in Colombia's modern record, and the reason every large quake along this coast eventually gets measured against it, this one included. But the comparison holds only up to a point, and that point is depth. Tumaco broke 23 kilometers down, precisely where two plates physically meet and can violently shove the seafloor upward. This month's earthquake broke roughly 100 kilometers down, inside a plate that had already passed the interface and was already sinking into the mantle beneath it. No seafloor displacement, no tsunami trigger, no coastal evacuation order was ever needed, and Colombia's Geological Service and the USGS agree on that distinction even while they continue disagreeing over the exact fault geometry. It's also worth remembering what ordinary actually looks like in this country. Colombia records around 2,500 earthquakes every month, and the overwhelming majority pass entirely unfelt, logged only by instruments nobody outside a laboratory ever sees. This earthquake stood out not because Colombia suddenly became more dangerous overnight, but because of exactly where inside the plate it happened. Close to the northern limit of the zone where earthquakes this large and this deep are even known to occur along the entire South American subduction system. So does one massive rupture inside the Nazca slab raise the risk everywhere else in the country? Not directly, not yet. Colombia's other major fault systems, including the Eastern Frontal Fault responsible for smaller, damaging earthquakes near Bogota in both 2023 and 2025, are structurally independent of what just happened in Chaco. Different plates in contact, different accumulated stress, different timelines entirely. That fault sits on land, driven by the slower grinding of two crustal blocks sliding past each other. Nothing like the deep sinking slab process that just ruptured under Chaco. That much is reassuring. Here is the part that genuinely isn't settled yet. Seismologists studying subduction zones openly acknowledge that a rupture this large can redistribute stress onto nearby, still unbroken sections of the same slab. The same basic way removing one brick from a wall changes the load carried by the bricks beside it. Whether that redistribution is happening here, whether the segments of the Nazca Plate adjacent to this rupture are now quietly carrying more strain than they were a week ago, isn't something anyone can answer by pointing backward at 1979. It can only be answered by watching patiently what this specific plate does next. As of Wednesday, 3 days after the main shock, Colombia's confirmed death toll stands at 265 people, according to the country's president, with more than 3,700 injured and over 4,000 still reported missing, more than 160 of them Spanish citizens alone. The number has climbed steadily since Monday, from an early estimate of just over 100 to more than double that by midweek, not because the disaster itself grew larger, but because rescue teams kept reaching remote, harder-to-access places they simply couldn't get to in the first confused hours. Colombia's newly inaugurated president, sworn in only days before the earthquake struck, is now leading a national emergency response instead of the transition he expected to be managing. International aid is arriving from across the region and beyond it. Rescue teams and supplies pledged from neighboring South American governments as well as partners overseas, some of it tied directly to nations whose own citizens are among the missing. Search crews are still working through collapsed buildings in Cali and Pereira, some of it by generator light after power failures left entire neighborhoods dark. What's confirmed right now, the magnitude, the intraslab mechanism, the aftershock count climbing past 100 and still rising. What remains genuinely unresolved, the exact fault plane, the final death toll, and whether this aftershock sequence is truly decaying or simply pausing between pulses. Here's what actually changes the story from this point forward. Seismologists are watching three specific things: whether the aftershocks stay deep, confined inside the slab where this rupture occurred, or begin migrating upward toward the shallow interface, the kind of shift that would matter enormously for tsunami risk along this coast. Whether the strongest individual shocks keep shrinking over time, the ordinary pattern of a sequence winding down, or spike unexpectedly again, the way this earthquake's own depth reading spiked and shifted during those first confused hours. Whether GPS stations along the coast detect any measurable ground deformation, the slow physical creeping that sometimes follows a large slab rupture and can hint at where stress is migrating next. And whether Purasay, still sitting on its own orange alert for entirely unrelated reasons, continues quietly along its separate timeline or not. That contested depth number, the one that moved from 82 kilometers to well past 100 before any agency fully agreed on it, was never just a data error from a chaotic first day. It is the exact measurement scientists are now watching evolve in something close to real time on instruments scattered across Chaco and Valle del Cauca, feeding into a control room somewhere in Bogota where the needles have not really stopped moving since Monday morning. If you felt this one, wherever you were standing when it hit, the data collected from people like you is part of how that picture keeps getting sharper. One more point on a map that is still, 3 days later, being redrawn in real time.